All right, welcome. Today we're going to unpack one of the most influential stories ever told, the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. We're going to explore all the key moments and the truly radical ideas that launched a global faith, and we'll be drawing everything directly from the foundational accounts.
So, the big question is, who was Jesus Christ really? And how in the world did his teachings from over 2,000 years ago end up shaping so much of our history? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Every story has a starting point, and this one begins with circumstances that are described as nothing short of miraculous. So let's dive into those early years. The story kicks off with his birth in Bethlehem to the Virgin Mary, followed by a pretty quiet upbringing in Nazareth as a carpenter. But what's really fascinating is just how little we actually know about these formative years. I mean, besides one really standout event when he was 12, where he apparently stunned the religious scholars in the Jerusalem temple with his wisdom, his first 3 decades are basically a mystery. Okay, so this timeline kind of gives us the whole arc of the story in one shot. It all starts with his birth, then we jump ahead 30 years to the beginning of his public ministry. From there, things move really fast through those dramatic final events, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and then finally, the ascension. After those 3 decades of, obscurity, the story just suddenly hits the accelerator. And this is where we get into the second act, his revolutionary public ministry. And this is the moment everything changes. His baptism by John the Baptist, it's not just some ceremony. It's the official starting gun for a whirlwind 3-year mission. From this point forward, he's traveling all over the region, teaching, healing, and performing miracles that started drawing these massive crowds. And his teaching methods, they were totally different. He wasn't lecturing from a podium or anything. Instead, he gathers this core group of followers, his disciples, who literally travel with him. The accounts are just filled with stories of miracles, from healing the sick to controlling nature. But maybe his most famous teaching tool of all was the parable. So what exactly is a parable? Well, it's just a brilliant teaching technique. You take a simple, relatable story to get across a much deeper moral or spiritual lesson. It was his way of making these huge, profound ideas accessible to absolutely everyone. And you can really see their power in these famous examples, right? The Good Samaritan. That's all about having compassion, even for your enemies. The prodigal son is this incredible story of unconditional forgiveness. And the lost sheep? Well, that emphasizes the value of every single individual. Each one is a simple story, but with a world-changing idea packed inside. So we've seen how he taught, but now let's get to the what. What was the revolutionary core message that he was actually delivering? A huge part of his message was a direct challenge to the religious establishment. He was always shifting the focus from the letter of the law, a super strict adherence to rules, to the spirit of the law. He cared about the moral intent behind the rule. For instance, he argued that while the law said no work on the Sabbath, doing something good, like healing someone, that was always the right thing to do. And you see these key themes pop up again and again in his teachings. This idea of the kingdom of God, a new spiritual reality, a radical, totally countercultural focus on the marginalized, the poor, the outcasts, the people society had forgotten. And then there's this really challenging ethic, nonviolence, and the command to love your enemies. And if you had to boil all of this down to just one central idea, this would be it. When someone asked him to name the single most important commandment, he put 2 together: love God and love your neighbor. According to the accounts, this is seen as the perfect summary of his entire moral framework. So let's move into the final dramatic act of his life, which, as you'll see, contains the absolute cornerstones of the Christian faith. His final days just unfold in this rapid, intense sequence. It kicks off with the Last Supper, a final meal with his disciples. But right after that comes his arrest and trial. He's sentenced by the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and then executed by crucifixion, an event that's viewed as a sacrifice for the sins of humanity. But the story doesn't end there. It culminates in the resurrection, his rising from the dead 3 days later. And that brings us to the conclusion of his time on earth. 40 days after the resurrection, the final event is the ascension, where he's described as returning to heaven. This is what marks the formal end of his ministry here on earth. So the earthly story comes to a close. But what about the legacy? What did that story and its message leave behind that has endured for so long?
When it's all said and done, the story we've just walked through is way more than just a historical account. For billions of people, it's a living message. Those core themes we talked about, that radical love, compassion for the outsider, the promise of redemption, they all continue to inspire and transform lives and cultures all over the world, even today.
So I'll just leave you with this final thought to chew on. From the parables to the miracles, from the command to love your neighbor all the way to the resurrection itself, what single part of this story do you think has had the biggest impact on our world?